Hi everyone, welcome to this week's online causal inference seminar. Today we are excited to welcome Professor Francesco Locatello from Institute of Science and Technology, Austria, to present powering causality with machine learning, discovery, representations, and inference. And as our discussant, we will have Jason Hartford from University of Manchester and Valence Labs. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Let me quickly share the screen.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that today's Q&A is handled by Sarah. So Sarah, please quickly introduce how it works. Thanks.
Oh, fair enough. I think people already know, but just in case, please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask questions, and then we'll check your questions. And if they are quick and easy to clarify, maybe we'll interrupt Francesco in the middle. I will read them out, but most likely we'll for longer questions, wait until the end, and then I will ask Francesco, he will answer. And if there is some further clarifications, you can continue discussing in the Q&A. So now, without further ado, the floor is yours, Francesco.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for the invitation. Very excited to talk here. I've been following the seminar for a while, and I've been a discussant, and it's very, very nice to receive this invitation. So today I want to talk about some of the works that we have done in the past like 3-ish years, but mostly the past year, on powering causality with machine learning, and really looking at the whole stack of causal areas, like starting from discoveries, like representations and inference. So I want to start with a little reflection on causal representation, which was also in a way how I personally approached causality. And I want to start with this quote from the Towards Causal Representation Learning review paper, and this comes from the abstract, and we said in this article we review blah blah blah, thereby assaying how causality can contribute to modern machine learning research, and this also applies in the opposite direction. We wrote this in 2021, and I think it's initially, at least, this direction of causality into machine learning has seen significantly more work within the causal representation learning community. We didn't have back then that many identifiability results, and people were generally trying some causality inspired ideas and trying to import them into machine learning and see what happens. Typically, this resulted in crazy architectures that didn't scale very well, and so it's perhaps not surprising that that this direction hasn't really kept up with progress in machine learning. The other direction, how machine learning can support causality, I would argue is comparatively understudied, especially within the CRL community. Of course, there's a lot of people who think about both causality and machine learning, but the causal representation learning line of works have not really focused on open problems in causality. In the past couple of 2-3 years, I would say the biggest focus for causal representation learning has been on proving identifiability in different settings. In this talk, I really want to highlight 3 opportunities for machine learning in causality, but really covering, I guess, what to me are the big areas of causality research, starting from causal reasoning, which is actually how I'm going to end the talk. Quantifying the effect of a known cause to an outcome, knowing the graph. I will start with causal discovery and sprinkle in causal representations throughout. So if you want, you can really see these 3 areas as somewhat complementary. If you know the graph, you can do causal reasoning. If you don't know the graph, but you know the variables, you can do causal discovery. If you don't know the variables, that's where causal representation learning comes in. And I think this is a nice in a way, like reference for what is to come. Okay, so the broad scope of this talk will be on powering causality with machine learning. And the question that I would like to explore is at least that I've also been exploring in my research in the past couple of years, how can learning algorithms discover causal structure and support causal reasoning? I will start with causal discovery using score matching. This doesn't really have much to do with causal representation learning in the way we intend it today, but I still think it's very interesting. Then I will move to causal representation learning, and in particular, the recent work that we've been doing in my group, and conclude with prediction power causal inference. Okay, so in causal discovery, the key idea that I've been exploring for the application of machine learning into this causal task was to decouple the problem of fitting some statistical quantity and then extracting causal knowledge from it. So in some sense, you can still think of it as a sort of like causal representation, of course, in a somewhat contrived way. The idea here is that, you know, like we have data and we want to learn a model, which will learn a representation from the data. And we want to be able to extract the causal structure from this model. And in particular, the class of models that I've looked at is modest estimates the score of the data, so the gradient of the log likelihood, which is also a very popular term in modern generative modeling. So you can see here a little depiction, like you would have two Gaussians, and the score are these arrows, like the gradients of the likelihood. And now, of course, like we know that in general, causal discovery requires special care in terms of assumptions. And I mostly focused in the setting where we can make assumptions on the function class. In particular, in this presentation, I will focus on nonlinear mechanisms with additive Gaussian noise, but these assumptions can be relaxed. Okay, so the key intuition for this methodology is that we want to exploit the structure in the score to deduce the causal structure. So the starting point is the score, which we estimate without caring about causality whatsoever. This is purely a statistical problem. We will obtain an estimator of the score, and this approximate the log likelihood. And here I'm writing it for an individual variable j. Now I can, after I train the model, I can bring in my causal assumptions. And as I said earlier in this talk, I'm focusing on nonlinear mechanisms F with additive Gaussian noise. Gaussianity is not actually necessary. We had done some follow-up works like relaxing this assumption, and the method is generally very robust to assumption violations, but in this talk, I will focus on the Gaussian exposition because it's the cleanest and the easiest to follow. Okay, now under this assumption, I can actually compute like in a parametric form what my likelihood would be like. And now I also know how to take derivatives, so I can actually compute what I expect the score of a certain variable xj to look like. And this is what we get, which is really simply the derivative of the log likelihood with respect to an individual variable xj. Now, the interesting thing about this equation is that we can really like view it as these two separate terms. We have this first term, which directly depends on xj, and is linear in xj. Xj is the variables that we are considering. Then we have an additional term, which contains a derivative of the mechanism going into xj, and it starts with the sum over the children of xj. So now, actually, the mechanism is going from xj to its children. Sorry. The important thing to notice is, yeah, it starts with the sum over the children of xj. So if a node has no children, we will not have this. And further inside the sum, we have this derivative of the mechanism with respect to xj. So this overall term would be nonlinear. So this gives us a way to tell whether a node, just looking at the score, will have children or not. And this we can like test in many ways. What we explored in the original paper was simply taking another derivative, which then for a leaf node would be constant, and so the variance over our observed data should be 0. How does this give us the causal structure? Well, the idea is that we're gonna use this test, which finds leaves from the score to iteratively find leaves and then removing them from the graph. So let's say this is the graph that we would like to discover. We have observation from x1 to x4. Of course, we don't know the edges. What we will do is to compute our like second derivative of the log likelihood. We check the variance and then pick as a leaf the node that has like the value closest to 0. Now, a question that we may be interested in looking at is, well, when will we pick the right node? Of course, this depends on how good our approximation of the score is. The nice thing about this method is that we can also give like very nice and somewhat intuitive sample complexity results. Like the important thing is that you know, we don't confuse the statistical error in our score estimation with the variance that comes from like that node that is not a leaf would have. So what we prove is that in this class of model, non-leaf nodes have the variance which is of the derivative of the score, which is sufficiently bounded away from 0. And this constant Cm will also tell us essentially how much error we can tolerate in our score estimation. This constant is also like somewhat intuitive, is defined as the largest value satisfying this inequality, which is relating the curvature of the mechanism with the variance on the child node. You can think of it as a sort of like signal to noise ratio. This is intuitive because if the child node has a ton of variance, then in particular, like coming from its noise, then we would expect the statistical footprint from the parent to be hard to detect, which will then ultimately require more samples. Also, like we expect the curvature of the mechanism to play a critical role because we are assuming additive Gaussian noise. So we know that if the mechanism was linear, even with infinite samples, we would not be able to like detect the cause from effect. And so with this, we can give like an error bound, which depends on this crucial constant Cm, which we call the identifiability margin, and converges linearly in the number of samples. Okay, so we can actually, you know, with a decent probability, identify leaves. And now, after we find the leaf, it's very easy to just remove it from the graph. Leaves have no causal effects on other nodes, so we can just drop them and then continue and repeat our process. So now, like, we can find some other leaf nodes. Let's say we discover X4 as a leaf, and then continue until we fix the whole topological ordering of the graph. Now, at this point, we don't have yet the causal direction. In fact, the graph potentially could be fully connected. And what we do is to start with a fully connected graph and then start pruning edges. Like this you can do in many ways. You could do sparse regression, or you could also, again, look at the score. Because we know that for a leaf node, we will only have this particular term in the score decomposition. So it's easy to see that a leaf node will depend non-linearly on its parents in the score. And so you can also construct a similar test to detect the parents of a leaf node. This is related to older work on the identification of Markov networks from the score function. Like the key innovation here is that we are also able to find leaves, because if you can find the skeleton of the graph, but then you can also find leaves, then you can orient all the edges. And these methods work fairly well. It's comparing here. I'm only going to show you the SHD comparison with some standard approaches. We have like extensive comparison, especially when it comes to the robustness to assumption violation in separate papers. But what I really want to focus here is the scalability that is afforded by the use of scalable machine learning approaches. So we can very easily scale to thousands of nodes on just like a normal laptop. And the overall total complexity of the algorithm is only squared in the number of variables. So this is a bit like the first works that I've done in really thinking about how machine learning can power some causality problems. I think this direction is interesting because it really enables like state-of-the-art, both scalable but also efficient algorithms. And you can look at these quantities both from the computational perspective, but also statistically. Okay, now to enter more like the core part of the talk, I want to start talking about causal representation learning. And causal representation learning can really be taught as, in a way, the natural extension to the work that people were doing in the late 2010s on disentangled representations. In disentangled representations, we had access to high-dimensional observations that we assume to be generated by some independent latent variables. And the goal was to train a neural network for which the representation aligned somewhat with these latent variables. So, for example, if I did an intervention in the real world, for example, I would change the value of one latent variable, which has a semantic meaning. In this case, is the color of the floor in this simple image. Then I would get a corresponding like change, a sparse change in my representation. This can be taught as, in a way, the precursor of causal representation learning, because in a way it's the trivial causal graph where all the variables are independent and there's no edges, no latent edges. Now, the problem was that even without latent causal connections, these entangled representations are not identifiable without supervision or some other inductive biases. Now, it turns out that this non-identifiability is not that difficult to break, luckily. And the first idea that at least like I personally explored it was having access to multiple observations at the same time, which are now non-IID. And while the two observations may be quite different if we look at them from the pixel perspective, if we have an appropriate representation, like their difference would be sparse. And this was motivated by at least like the intuition that such data would not be too hard to collect. For example, like if you have like a video of a robotic platform, then, you know, like if the frames are relatively close to each other, then you would expect not everything to change. Now, this is very easy to turn into a supervision signal because we can embed these two images with the same neural networks and then essentially force our encoder to follow our assumption that these two images in the appropriate representation space will be mostly similar. And so, for example, in this case, we allocated a little budget in terms of, for example, a single dimension that is allowed to be different between these two images. And now the very similar idea we also applied in the setting where you have at least like simple latent causal relations. And here is also where we define this notion of block identifiability, which will come back in the talk. So here we are specifically focusing on recovering this content variable. We assume that the original observations are a function of some content variable which we wish to recover and some other style variables. And we can generate these paired observations by performing like style change, like manipulate the style variable. And in particular, we thought that data augmentation could be a good way to do that. And our goal was to learn the content variable in the sense that we estimate some variable C hat, which contains only information about C and not of S. So it's related to the true content by some unknown function H. Now, since then, a lot of works have been proposed to identify these causal representations like under different settings. These works have been typically arranged in the different steps of Peirce causal hierarchy, although there are also some other works which is not at least immediately clear where one would place them. Now, before really starting to talk about methods, I want to offer a slightly different perspective on causal representation, which we recently formalized in a preprint, which is using this like measurement perspective of causal representation learning. So let's say we have these three variables here, which have some causal connection with each other. Now, if I knew the variables, of course, like I could do causal discovery and find the edges under suitable assumptions, of course. Now, what does it mean to know the variables? Knowing the variables means that, like we are actually able to directly measure what the value of these variables are in individual realizations. In causal representation learning, we are looking at maybe a slightly different settings where the way we measure our latent variables is by entangling them. We take a picture which tells me everything there is to know in principle about these latent variables, but it's entangling their information, it's entangling their measurements into some high-dimensional observations. Now, this is not really changing anything into the way we do causal representation. We still take a neural network, which is going to learn a representation. We know that like a causal representation exists, and we want to align the representation of this model to my latent variables. And this we can do with this notion of block identifiability that I have just discussed. However, this perspective also opens like a slightly different interpretation. And here, I'm really trying to be closer to the original idea of representation learning from Joshua over 10 years ago. So ultimately, what do we want out of a representation, especially like a causal representation? Well, we want that the representation makes it easier or possible at all, since we are talking about causality, to extract some causal information using some downstream estimator. And we can really think of both the observations, but also the causal representation at different measurements of these latent causal variables, which potentially have different degrees of entanglements. So we could start from a fully entangled measurement of my latent variables, and then depending on the assumptions that I can make or the data I can collect, I can either perfectly measure the latent variables, which means like I have individual parts of my representation that only measure an individual latent variable, or some latent variables will remain mixed. The nice thing about like this perspective is that it also tells us nicely what are the conditions for what we call the causal validity of the representation for a downstream estimator. As we are formulating this, in a causal diagram, we have some specific conditional independencies that we know should hold. For example, I hope you can see my mouse in this example here. If I condition on Z3, I'm blocking all the paths that go into Z hat A3. And this gives me like a testable implication for my measurement. Now, having something like this is not sufficient yet for using the Z hats as plug-in replacements for the causal variables, because it depends a little bit on what we want to do. So the actual estimator that we want to employ needs to be invariant to our measurement function h. And this really depends on what you want to do. For example, if you want to estimate treatment effects, then of course, like in at least like the classical average treatment effects, like you actually need to get a pointwise approximation of your Z. You cannot reparameterize it. But the story is different if you are trying to model confounding or instrumental variables. So what is the role of identifiability in this perspective? Well, identifiability specify, in a way, an expectation that we have on our model. So identifiability is specifying what we expect the individual dimensions in our model to measure. And these conditional independencies, which are entailed by this measurement model, can also be numerically tested. And so for this, we also propose a score, which we call TMAX, for test-based mutual exclusivity score, which can be used to evaluate the quality of your causal representation, addressing some of the issues for the typical evaluation metrics that are used in causal representation learning, like the MCC and R-square. The measurement models also tells us when a representation can be used as a valid proxy of causal variables. If you just want to use some off-the-shelf estimator and replace the true measurement of the variable, which of course you don't have, with this representation. And this notion of causal validity, I like it because it also entails like a very natural notion of error, which is now defined as the error for your statistical approximation of a causal estimate, using the representation instead of the true variables. And we're going to talk a bit more about this later on. Okay, so this is at least like how I think about causal representations. And we haven't discussed methods yet. Recently, we took a closer look at this landscape of causal representation learning research, and attempted to unify these different settings using a single language. And the language that we used is that of invariance relationships. So we start by saying that two subsets of some vectors, which would correspond to our true latent variables, but also then our representation, are equivalent, belong to the same equivalence class if they are equal after projection by some arbitrary function iota. Ultimately, to describe when two subvectors belong to the same equivalence class, it's sufficient to specify a discriminant which tells me whether two vectors are the same according to this equivalence relationship or are not the same. And so we can interpret causal representation learning in this way, that we assume access to multiple non-IAD groups of samples. And we assume that all the samples in the same group are equivalent in some sense. And this equivalence is specified by some equivalence relationship. And what causal representation learning methods are doing is aligning the representation with these equivalences. And the reason why we do that is because we believe this to be relevant to a task and connects to this like measurement model. So just to show an example how this would work, like here we have two observations, x1 and x2, and our assumption is that these two observations are the same in the sense that a part of the latent space is the same according to a particular equivalence relationship iota 1. So this could be a pointwise equality, but in general, like it's an arbitrary equivalence relationship. Then we could have, for example, like another observation x3, which is in an equivalence class together with x2, but not x1. And they may share some different latent variables, perhaps according to a different function, iota 2. And these two functions need not be the same. So how do we align the representation? Well, we do exactly the same thing that we did in the disentanglement case. We force the representation to follow assumptions. So we have some invariance assumptions on our observations, and we translate them in our representation. So we said the x1 and x2 should share two variables. And so we formulate our invariance relationship in a specific subset of the latent space. We do the same for x2 and x3, and this is our invariance constraint. Now, this is of course not yet enough for identifiability. What we also want is that our representation is a lossless compression of the data. This can be done in many ways. You could train a decoder which tries to reconstruct the data. Like formally, you can also just write it as trying to preserve the entropy of the data. So since we assume that the mapping from the latent variables to the observations x is invertible, we want the mutual information between the true latents and the recovered latents to be the same as the entropy of the true latents. And if we can satisfy these two constraints, then we achieve block identifiability in the definition that we had discussed earlier. So now a question that at least I asked myself when we started working on this is what is actually causal about this? And what is causal about this is that we assume that there are some causal variables on which these invariances are defined. Now, the specific source of this invariance may or may not directly follow from a classical causal assumption. Like it could be an intervention, but it could also be some other information that you can have. Again, this doesn't have to be strictly causal if you only want to learn the variables, but don't need the graph. If you also need the graph, then of course, like, you need to be able to identify the variables, and then you need sufficient assumptions that allow you to identify the graph. For example, like these additive noise models that we saw earlier. If your assumptions that you need for the causal representation are already in a way causal, then you can combine. But just to prove this point, we did a little numerical simulation, like defining like a different type of intervention, which changes the distribution of this example of Z2. It also cuts the incoming edge from Z1, but also has a shield in front of Z3. So Z3 doesn't realize that an intervention has happened, and the values of Z3 are still sampled, like thinking Z2 didn't change the distribution. Of course, this doesn't make a lot of sense from a causal perspective, but it still like entails like a notion of marginal invariance now on Z1 and Z3, which is very similar to like the signal that an intervention will pick up. And in fact, you can apply off-the-shelf interventional causal representation learning methods, and then they do exactly what you would expect. They block identify Z1 and Z3, because it doesn't matter that the source of this marginal invariance is a properly, executed intervention. Another example is the interventional causal representation learning. Here I'm showing 2 coupled intervention per node just for simplicity, but in the paper we go through many of these different settings. So here we can define the invariance looking at the score of the log likelihood comparing 2 interventional distributions. In the 2 interventional distribution, only one of the conditions will be different, which is isolated by this derivative. And so it will be non-zero only on an intervened node. And this also allows us to mix different invariances, which also enables us to prove new identifiability results if you care about this. Another example is for temporal causal representation learning, which is roughly as follows. Like you have a sequence of latent states which are measured in observations, and now I'm talking only about like this paper because it's again the simplest to explain. We have the causal relations that unfold over time, and then we have an agent which is taking an action, and this action affects the natural dynamics of these latent variables in a way very similar to what an intervention would do. The agent is also able to predict in a way the counterfactual trajectory as if it didn't perform the action, and then can compare its expectation on the default dynamics with what actually happened. And this gives you the invariance that drives the disentanglement signal. Okay, so because representation learning, we can now very well like theoretically characterize when representations like yield causally valid estimates, and also how do we learn them, because the identifiability results tell us what we expect the causal representation to measure, and the measurement model tells you which causal task can you do with this specific measurement function. And now I want to conclude by discussing this line of work, which is tightly integrated with the previous ones on prediction power causal inference. So here we are working together with experimental ecologists here on campus, and they're interested in ants behaviors. They study ants in their daily research. And in particular, they're interested in understanding the social mechanism that governs ant colonies. Apparently, ants are very social animals that have very complex policies, especially involving keeping their colony free from parasites, diseases, and things like this. So as an ant goes in the world to do ant stuff, it may come in contact with things that should not be brought back into the colony. And so the next mate, what they will do is realize that this ant has been exposed to something that is potentially dangerous to the colony, and then they will groom off this substance, which basically they will eat it. And now, a specific question that our collaborators are interested in is, which substances do these ants respond to, and what are the signals that they pick up? So now, if you want to answer this type of question, then what you would do is to design and conduct an experiment, which means synthesizing some substance that you want to test, having some control, and then you randomly split ants into treated and control group, and then treat the ants and put them together with nestmates, take a video and see what happens. Now, of course, with everything that we've been discussing, it's clear that we don't want to have a PhD student to look at this video and determine whether there is a significant difference between the treated and the control group. But this should be done by a machine learning model. So for this, we curated and released the ISTAnt dataset, which is the first benchmark, at least to my knowledge, to estimate causal effects from real-world ecological videos that are collected within a randomized control trial. Of course, like we label every frames for this grooming behavior that we're interested in. And the key difference between this data set and many other data sets that exist also in ecology for behavior classification is that other benchmarks stop at validating the statistical accuracy of the models that you train. But our question is slightly different because our problem is that we want to estimate these causal effects. So the quantity that we want to estimate is the average treatment effect. Since we have design the data collection ourselves, we can nicely formulate this into this measurement model as we've seen earlier. So we have some experimental variables, we have a treatment that cause the behavior, and then we measure like an entangled view of these three variables. Now, our effect is not fully observed, and we have some selection variable which, possibly depending on the experimental conditions, tells us whether an individual frame should be labeled by a PhD student or by a neural network. Now, importantly, this is a randomized control trial, so there is no edge from W to T. So since it's a randomized control trial, this average treatment effect can be just estimated by associational difference. And this obviously is under the standard assumptions that we have positivity and no confounding. Now, this is also under the assumption that we actually can measure Y directly, but we cannot measure Y directly. We can only measure Y through the neural network. And so the quantity that we look at is what we call the treatment effect bias, which is very simply the difference between the average treatment effect if you use Y or you use the model predictions f of x. And here we have simply rearranged the terms to show the bias in the treatment population and the control population. And the assumption we make in this paper is that we are allowed to use some of the data from the target experiments to train our model. Okay, so still, unfortunately, a lot of things can go wrong. The first non-obvious question is like what data we should label for transfer learning. Now, of course, like as machine learning and causality researchers, like we know we should label like random samples, like they should be as independent as possible. Now, the problem is that our colleagues like don't really want to label independent frames because it's very difficult for them to do that. They really look at the video to understand when this behavior starts, when it ends, and then they propagate the labels in between. And of course, like any non-random choice of labeling introduces selection bias, which then like transfers to our predictive model. And this is interesting because then, even though our data is perfect, our data is a randomized control trial, the model is introducing bias due to selection in its training set in the transfer learning.
Hi, Francesco. Sorry for interrupt, but
yeah.
Due to the time limit to have enough time for a discussion, it would be nice if you can wrap up in about like 3 or 5 minutes.
Yes, I would be able to.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so now we can use the invariance principle to debias our model. For example, assuming that our representation stays invariant across experiment settings. And so we can take a model which is trained in a bias design from selection bias, and by increasing regularization, we can reduce the bias in the conclusion. And interestingly, this model is also using VREX to implement the invariance condition, and we see a small deviation in accuracy, but a very strong effect in the reduction of the causal error. The second problem is in the choice of the model. And here we can see first a scatter plot and then some rank correlation between the balanced accuracy and the treatment effect bias. And what we see very clearly is that this is an underspecified setting. Like we have many models that achieve like very high accuracy, but they are arranged in kind of like these vertical stripes in the scatter plot. So these models have very similar accuracy, but very different treatment effect bias. So the accuracy alone is not a good indicator of downstream causal performance. So what you can do is to estimate treatment effect bias on a validation set, but then again, you need to be very careful on how you choose a validation set. The other thing you could do is then to go back to the measurement model. And, you know, on the left-hand side here, we have our original measurements. On the right-hand side, we have what we wish to learn. And this gives us a test condition on why we want our predictions to be independent of the treatment assignment, for example. And this can actually be implemented as a way to do model selection. The nice thing is that we don't need the data to really follow the trial distribution as long as this conditional independence still holds, which is quite nice. Last thing that one should be careful is post-processing. Again, to be brief, one should not threshold the predictions to make them binary, otherwise it introduces bias. Now, until now, I've only, you know, just trained the models and then hope for the best. But we can actually force our model to yield causally valid measurements. And what we need to essentially force is this conditional calibration, which implies that if we then run APW on the predictions, we get valid estimates with the correct confidence intervals. And to enforce this conditional calibration, we go back to this conditional independence constraint. We want that condition on the observed labels, our prediction should be independent from treatment assignments and other covariates. And so literally, we just fix this conditional independence as a constraint for our transfer learning. And now if the representation generalizes well, this is the last results I want to show, then we can also transfer well across multiple experiments. And so we tested it on different iterations of our recording platform, and we have theoretical results that guarantee the causal validity of the model in the target population under the assumption that the representation transfers well and the causal lifting constraint is satisfied on the target population. This is the result. DERM is our method compared against ERM, VREX, and IRM. And what we can observe is that our method always overlaps at least 33% with the true confidence interval, but most importantly, never flips the conclusion of our study. So we always conclude that the treatment increases the effect. So this is also another area where causality and machine learning can go very well together, and we have the first, like I would say, like really positive results on real-world problems. So this is my last slide to conclude. I think overall, machine learning has a great opportunity in powering all of causal analysis, and there are really key applications in scientific discovery. Overall, like solving causal questions is subtle, and sometimes it's hard to tell when we are successful, so it requires some care. But definitely just chasing predictive accuracy may not then lead to success if you care about the causal conclusions that are drawn from your predictions. And I would argue that this is particularly important in AI for science. Like if your question is causal, then the question needs to be part of the benchmark. And the way I'm thinking about causal representation learning this day is that we want to learn representations that makes it easier or possible to extract causal information downstream. And with this, I thank you very much. I'm sorry that I went a little bit over time. I would like to thank my group and also say that I'm looking for a postdoc. So if someone in the audience is looking for a postdoc and like our research, then feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for the great talk. Due to the interest of time, let's directly move on to the discussion by Jason.
Cool. Zoom keeps warning me that my internet's unstable, so please stop me if you can't hear me. Okay, and I'll just jump straight into it. Okay, so I'm going to give contextualize it from my perspective, where this work lands, just with my very oversimplified history of causality in one slide. If we think of like a toolbox of causal inference, for the first 250 years, we had one tool, and that was experimentation, right? So whether you were James Lind in the 1700s, figuring out scurvy, or John Snow in the late 1800s, showing that cholera was caused by dirty water, used experiments to show that this was in fact true. And it was really the 1950s debate around smoking and cancer that showed the need that we really needed causal inference from observational data. And the suite of tools that we have today that was developed sort of from 70s to today, excluding instrumental variables, gave us that suite of tools, and it fundamentally changed how we do, how certain sub-sciences do their work, right? Like econ has completely changed how they, from a sort of theory-driven field to kind of more empirical science through this process. Now, I would argue, and I think Francesco's work supports this really nicely, that if we could develop tools that allow us to do causal inference tasks from unstructured data, like Francesco presented, or some of the work that we work with my colleagues at Valence, this would just open up a new set of tools that would allow us to do new kinds of science, right? So I think it's the sort of strongest motivation for what we want to be doing here. Now. I kind of think, again, sort of revisionist history, if you think about this path to that point, you could think like ICA literature in the 90s with linear ICA, hey, identifiability is possible if we assume non-Gaussian results. Then we have a set of negative results that show that this is impossible in general from IID data, including from Francesco himself. And then we've had this kind of chipping away of assumptions, right? We've had sort of this suite of assumptions that have allowed us to get closer and closer to, well, closer and closer up this hill, but how far up the mountain do we have to go? And how far, there's a sort of question of how far up that mountain we still have to climb in order so we get to the point where we have actually useful causal representation learning methods that are sort of powerful and applicable in the sciences. Now, I think Francesco's work with the ANTS data sets is a nice example of sort of where we can get to, but that's kind of going to motivate my first point of questions. So I've got two kinds of questions. The ones are kind of more specific to this talk, and the ones are more speculative. The next slide is more speculative, and I'm going to go quick because I know we're short on time. Okay, so traditionally, in causal inference, effect estimation tends to be easier in the sense that you need fewer assumptions than discovery in order to kind of have the algorithms work. I'm curious, Francesco, whether you think that the same holds for working from unstructured data when we don't have labels, right? So in prediction-powered inference, you assume that you have access to this label that's given to you, that's sort of labeled setting. But then if we kind of didn't have that label, are we just back in the world of representation learning from unstructured data? Or is there sort of some kind of weaker setting in between where we don't have, we don't have the label, but it's nevertheless an easier problem than trying to sort of disentangle completely and effectively do causal discovery on the latent variables. So that class of questions, and I think I'm just going to go through, and Francesco, you can choose which questions you want to answer, and we can we'll go from there. So the more speculative, bigger term question is I think in causal representation learning, we're kind of solving a much harder problem than scientists are solving. And we're so motivated by scientists looking at ants under a microscope, but we're not only trying to sort of understand, trying to simulate what scientists do, which is sort of understand these systems when they're looking at ants. But we're also trying to learn how to see at the same time, right? We're learning both the sort of encoder from scratch. We don't come with any sort of preconceived notion of objects, relations, all the stuff that we learn, growing up from being toddlers to adults. And we also come to our data with a set of scientific theories often that sort of should explain how this data exists in the world, or how this data came to be. So, if you look at like the work by Popper and his colleagues on theory-laden observations, that's a sort of a nice way of, one way of thinking about that. So I'm asking, so I thought I'd ask, the sort of more general question is, should we be using kind of pre-existing understanding of the world in these scientific questions as we try and adapt these methods? If so, should we be using kind of foundational models trained on internet scale observational data? Like, do they have a role to play in these kinds of questions or not? And then separately, kind of, but perhaps relatedly, you've done work in kind of relative representations and the related ideas. There's these popular ideas around the Platonic representation hypothesis, which is again sort of saying, if when we do these large scale models, we actually get these pretty consistent representations up to transformations that you can get rid of, and curious how that would kind of tie back into the scientific applications. So that's it. You're muted.
Thank you, Jason, for the great discussion. We still have a few minutes left. So Francesco, do you want to briefly respond, and maybe you can
Yes, I would like to try to answer both questions. So I don't see this PPCI setting and causal representation setting to be fundamentally different in the sense that they both try to do the same thing. They both try to learn like a representation for some like individual variables, and in the PPCI setting is more direct. Like we just directly try to predict the value of y, and we need labels for that. But the reason why we do that is because we want to do like average written effects, like for like binary variables. Like, of course, like you could do it differently. You could have like some estimator which is invariant to like reparametrizations, like this like usual nonlinear transformation in CRL. There is some work from Dominic Jansing like 12 years ago or something like this that does that. But we wanted to stick closer to the like in a way traditional setting. So I don't see it as having like fundamentally different assumptions, except that in this prediction power causal inference we are laser focused on just one variable. We have done other works which I didn't have time to share, where, for example, like we try to model confounding, and there like nonlinear reparametrizations are fine. Okay, now the second part on the understanding how to see and the role of large language models and this like Platonic representation hypothesis and relative representations. So I completely agree that we should not be training these models from scratch, especially because if we think about like even like the simple like ISTAnt problem, like existing foundation models are pretty transferable, and if we are trying to like detect what is present in a video, like we shouldn't just learn to see from scratch on an individual example. Now the difficult question is what happens at the interplay between like the pre-training data that now can bias my model in now my much smaller like randomized trial, and I think that's the key question. At least like what I'm most excited about. There's a lot of people who have done a lot of work on trying to amortize in a way existing algorithms like into transformers and foundation models. This is not a direction that I'm currently exploring, with the idea being that like we know that the algorithms work, and like, I mean, we have agents now, so like as long as the agent is capable of picking whatever algorithms like works, then like it doesn't need to learn how to do causal inference in the forward pass. You could just like learn to execute APW in Python as long as you can give it predictions. For the relative representations, I think this is also very interesting. I think there is a distinction that we haven't really explored much in causal representation learning, which is like the models like seems to be identifiable in a statistical setting, meaning that like you run them multiple times and they learn similar parameters, and then we can interpret like whatever they have learned in a causal way using some additional assumptions. And it seems like in a way these two communities haven't fully like bridged yet. But I think this is the way to understand it. That these models like are identifiable in some sense from like, you know, they converge to the same thing. And sometimes we can interpret what these things is using the causality language. And again, sorry for going a bit over time.
Totally no worries. Thank you so much for the nice talk and nice discussion of all of the interaction afterwards. So again, for the interest of time, we don't have enough time for doing the Q&A. We have somewhat philosophical question, but we will forward this question to our speaker. So let us wrap up the seminar by sharing slide for next week. So next week, we will have Edward Kennedy from Carnegie Mellon to present causal inference with high-dimensional treatments. And we will have Ivan Diaz from NYU as our discussant. And we hope to see you all next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you.